This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K, Politi, Jan H, Tanya T, Veronica S, Gabby, Helen M, Ruth S, Sunny H, Scott K, JRM, Susie G, Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B, CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G, V! V, and Mary Beth R. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content. So please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke, and this week we have a figure that we are going to address from Phrygian mythology, and also we see elements of this story in both Greek and Roman mythology as well, and that is a figure known as Agdistis. Now, Agdistis is an interesting figure whose mythology opens up a whole range of topics that we could probably talk about on this podcast for hours and hours. So I feel like I have to rein myself in a little bit, although there are a few little rabbit holes I'd like to explore with this. Now, Agdistis is actually initially a hermaphrodite. Okay, is a deity that is dual sex, that has both sets of sex organs. And there's different mythologies as to how Agdistis becomes female only. Obviously, castration is an element here, but the origin story has its different variants, and we're going to look at those different variants. So I want to look at the mythology of Agdistis, and this is connected to the myth of Kybele and Attis for sure, because there is definitely a connection between the Earth Mother Kybele and Agdistis. So we're going to see the connections that we have there, but also, so what it opens up for me is, first of all, when we talk about the Earth Mother and the origins of the Earth Mother and creation myths. Okay, so if we can compare it, we're going to compare it, for instance, to Hesiod's myth of Ouranos and Gaia. See how this particular myth compares, or maybe even how one was potentially retrofitted into the other. But there's also the meaning of what creation myths have to do with, what they mean. And then if we think about the cults that surround Agdistis and, of course, Cybele, one of the main themes is, in fact, castration, in addition to looking at the idea of somebody who is intersexed or dual-sexed. So we want to look at some of the psychological meanings that might be behind these particular ideas. I mean, this is actually one of the ultimate stories if we're going to talk about things that relate to ideas of masculine and feminine. And this is something that has been discussed throughout. I want to say it was a topic for the philosophers. It certainly was a topic for the different historians and writers. And there are certainly certain aspects of Roman law, for example, in dealing with those who are born as hermaphrodites. And of course, where that term hermaphrodite originally comes from. Salmacis and Hermaphroditus, which is actually out of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which also deals with, first of all, the origin of the term hermaphrodite, and the way in which the hermaphrodite is said to have come about, at least through that mythology. Also, Plato's idea about the hermaphrodite from his Symposium, and then what it means to have a being that is dual-sexed and then separated. We do see examples of this in India as well with Sri Ardhanarishwara, which is a merging of Shiva Shakti or Shiva Parvati into one being, and the meanings behind that. And ultimately, what we're going to be looking at is, what is the idea of the power of a united masculine and feminine? What's implied by it in the stories? Because the various stories definitely give us some real interesting views as to how that the power of masculine and feminine working together, how threatening that was. And it leads us to some very interesting things to think about with regard to one of the big questions that I address in this podcast, or in Chthonia as a whole concept, is what is so threatening about certain aspects of female sexuality? And if you want to go further, what is threatening about those who are either part of the LGBTQ community? What is the threat there? Why is this something that people are so determined to shut down and deny rights? And trans people, the things that they go through, people who are born who are currently born who are intersex, because this is something that's happened throughout human history. You do occasionally, it's not a common thing necessarily, but you do have children who are born with both sets of organs, and then there's the whole controversy around what it means to be dual sexed, and what happens when a doctor makes a decision about what sex that child is going to be, and what kinds of psychological trauma and damage that causes as the child grows up. I mean, these are all different avenues, as this is what I mean when I say this is a huge topic that could go in many, many different directions. But I think what I want to do is stick to the core story. I want to talk about the idea of the hermaphrodite as the ancient Greeks and Romans viewed that particular being or person, if we were talking about a human child that was born as a hermaphrodite, and what we're looking at with this mythology. So in particular, the idea of the dual-sexed being that is castrated and made into a single-sex female being, and what the power of the dual-sexed being is thought to be, particularly with regard to the male and female aspects of that being, and what this means about our ideas about the Earth Mother and the Earth Mother cults, because at least one version of this story implies that the Earth Mother, if you look at Agdistis as being connected to the Earth Mother in some way, that the idea that this is, to a certain degree, if this is the origin of Kybele, this is at least in one version, the origin of the Earth Mother as a being who originally was also had a penis and now is just female. And what does that mean in terms of the role that the feminine ends up getting in the big picture? There's a rationale behind creation myths that doesn't have to do with just the very literal question of how the world came to be. It's not necessarily that people believe, just like now, we have certain stories that we think of as allegorical. Now, whether the ancient Greeks thought that way or not, it's hard to say, but certainly they are talking about forces that come together, namely the forces of sky and earth, and what happens, then and the separation of those forces, and what that means, and why separation is required for life. It's a huge topic here, and goes into a lot of different areas. So I'm going to do the best that I can. Certainly, if I miss things, I can always do an additional live stream, as I've said, on the topic, and I can also do potentially a part 2 if it seems like this is going to be too much. I am going to try to keep this. I say this every podcast. I'm going to try to keep this to an hour, but we'll see how we do. All right, so first things first, let's look at the basic stories about Agdistis and what we have here in the basic definitions from all the usual sources. In particular, I prefer theoi.com to Wikipedia, although Wikipedia has a lot of these entries have been updated by people who have the credentials to do so. So what's there is fairly reliable. I also use my graduate school dictionary of classical myth. And I'm also going to refer to Ovid's Metamorphoses directly, because when we're talking about hermaphrodites, and also Anthony Courbet's book, Sexing the World, which I refer to quite often, but it's because it's an interesting story about, an interesting linguistic analysis of how this idea of separation, which we already see in creation mythology, becomes really codified in Roman thinking. And because a lot of the thinking of a culture can be determined through its language, how people communicate. For instance, you'll hear of cultures that have no word for murder because there's no murder in their society. Just as a way of a simple example, the wording that's used to describe things and the way in which the Romans insisted on assigning gender to two different, when the word is applied to somebody who was considered to be biologically female or biologically male, you had to use a form of the word that reflected that male or female, biology, let's just say. For lack of realizing that's a complicated thing to say, but because a lot of people will talk about, well, the biology is not necessarily all that straightforward, but just for, the idea of who's identified as a man and a woman. So you had to use words that were feminine to identify women and words that were masculine to identify men. And if you had, because all language has gender, case, and number. So that's not, at least a lot of the Western languages do. Well, the Eastern languages do too. But the idea when you have this this separation by gender, the Romans were the first ones to say, okay, if this is a masculine word, like bonus, for instance, which is a Latin word for good, and that is a masculine second declension word. If you are applying it to a woman, you would say bona, which would be you're turning it into a first declension noun, which is feminine. So the idea is that you will even change the declension or the gender of the word to match the gender of who or what was being spoken about. So, for example, a goddess could be referred to as bona dea, even though the word deus is technically masculine. So, so stuff like that. There's this idea that the language has to reflect the separation, and it will be interesting to see what the Roman ideas were on the subject of hermaphroditism. Let me say that correctly, and how they felt when a child would have been born intersexed in such a way. So let's start with Agdistis. Let me start with the theoi.com definition, which is interesting. It says Agdistis was an ancient Phrygian goddess. So these are goddesses associated with Phrygia, like Kybele, like Attis. Their association is there. It says she was an hermaphroditic deity born when the Earth Mother was accidentally impregnated by the sleeping sky god. The gods, in fear of the strange double-gendered being, castrated it and so created the goddess Kybele. Okay. And Kybele, as we know, is one of the earliest examples that we have of the Earth Mother, of an Earth Mother goddess. And yet, as we see here, there's another Earth Mother besides Kybele. What might be comparable in the in the Greek, is the idea that you have Gaia, who is the Earth Mother, but oftentimes the Earth Goddess or the All Mother is also considered to be Rhea, who is the wife of Kronos, and so she is a Titan that is born of Gaia, and just like also after Rhea, you also have a goddess like Demeter. So you have all of these Earth Mother goddesses that are sort of successions of each other or connected with each other or different aspects of each other. So we have this here as well. So you have an Earth Mother who gives birth to this with the sky god, which okay, and this is what Theoi goes on to say. The story related by Pausanias, who is a Roman historian writer, was a Greek translation of the Phrygian myth, in which the Phrygian sky god is identified with Zeus. Since Kybele was usually identified by the Greeks with the goddess Rhea, it is somewhat curious that the writer names the sky god father Zeus instead of Ouranos, because that really, the parallel there would be the Ouranos and Gaia myth, where there is also a castration. Instead, Pausanias is saying, no, it's Zeus and not Ouranos. Now, part of me thinks that there might be an Orphic connection there, because the Orphic cosmogony is a little bit different from the one that we think of from Hesiod, where Ouranos and Gaia are the initial sky god, sky father, and Earth Mother, who mate, and they produce all of these monstrosities. They produce the Hecatonchires, the 100-handers, and the giants. And Ouranos is horrified by these children. Of course, they also create, most of the original 12 Olympians are also, actually they're born of Kronos and Rhea. Kronos is one of the original children of Gaia and Ouranos. And Kronos is the one who ends up being the successor in the Hesiod myth, and he becomes the successor by castrating his father. And we'll get into that in a minute. Because sorry for all the men listening here, but castration is actually a huge theme of this myth and of everything connected to it. So okay, Let me look at what Pausanias actually says here about the story. He says, the local Phrygian legend about him, meaning Attis, being this: Zeus, that they see, i.e. the Phrygian sky god, who was probably not Zeus, but this is what Pausanias says. It is said, let fall in his sleep seed upon the ground, which in course of time set up a daimon with 2 sexual organs, male and female. So mind you, Agdistis is not seen, we're using one thing that says that she's a goddess, but was originally conceived of as a daimon, or an intermediary kind of a spirit, like a natural force. They called the daimon Agdistis, but the gods, fearing Agdistis, cut off the male organ. There grew up from it an almond tree with its fruit ripe, and a daughter of the river Sangarius, they say, took the fruit and laid it in her bosom, when it at once disappeared, but she was with child. A boy was born and exposed, but was tended by a he-goat. Okay, so now that's interesting. You have a boy who's tended by a he-goat, which, as we know, that the goat imagery is often connected with the satyrs and with the beings of the forest, beings of the wild. In addition to, there's a lot of other associations, but we won't go there. As he grew up, his beauty was more than human. So this makes him very similar almost to Adonis in the Greek myth of Aphrodite and Adonis. And Agdistis fell in love with him. Okay, so Agdistis is now, just to try to sort out what's going on here. Agdistis is originally a hermaphrodite. Agdistis has their member removed and becomes considered to be a female. And the former phallus of Agdistis becomes this almond tree. And when a fruit from that tree falls on, the woman's name is Nana, it falls into her bosom, the daughter of the river god, then she becomes pregnant. So really, Attis is a child of Nana and Agdistis. But Agdistis is sort of the father and the mother at the same time, but the mother form falls in love with the male child. Okay, so just to be clear about what's happening here. When he had grown up, Attis was sent by his relatives to Pasinos, that he might wed the king's daughter. The marriage song was being sung when Agdistis appeared, and Attis went mad and cut off his genitals. And also did he who was giving him his daughter in marriage. But Agdistis repented of what she had done to Attis, and persuaded Zeus to grant the body of Attis should neither rot nor at all decay. And so, so this becomes kind of one of the earlier forms of what they call the dying and resurrecting vegetation god myth. A category of myth that my students always get wrong on the midterm examination. But it's, so later on when we have ideas of resurrection, like the resurrection of Jesus being obviously the most obvious thing, you might have similar stories connected to Osiris in the Egyptian, or perhaps even Horus ends up being kind of in these kinds of mythologies as well. But this idea of the god who dies and is resurrected, Attis becomes this kind of figure, but he's a castrated figure, and it's like, so he is, but it's rather than being resurrected though, his body becomes something that doesn't waste away, that doesn't decay. So in a sense, it's at least the body retains a kind of immortality. Agdistis had asked the Sky Father, or Zeus, to restore life to the boy, but Zeus refused to do that, or whomever the sky god was. So that's the legend. Now let's look at the legend from a different perspective. I'm going to look at the Classical Mythology Dictionary and see what they say. In Pausanias' version, Zeus spilt some semen on the earth, which begot Agdistis, a hermaphrodite. The other gods castrated Agdistis, and from his or her penis sprang an almond tree. Nana, the daughter of Sangarius, picked an almond from the tree, placed it in her lap, and became pregnant and gave birth to Attis. She abandoned him, but he was cared for by a goat. When Attis grew up, Agdistis, by this time purely female, fell in love with him, but he was sent to Pausanias to marry the king's daughter. Agdistis appeared after the marriage hymn had been sung, whereupon Attis castrated himself and died. Agdistis was so upset that she was granted that Attis's body should not decay. In another version, Zeus, having tried in vain to marry Kybele, let some of his semen fall on a nearby rock. Now remember how we had talked about the name Kybele really means black stone. So this is a slightly different version. This begot the hermaphrodite Agdistis. Dionysus made Agdistis drunk and castrated him, or him/her. From the blood grew a pomegranate tree. Okay, so this is different. One's an almond tree, this one it's a pomegranate. And remember, pomegranates have a very strong association with the Chtonic, with the underworld. And also with love and lust and sex. Well, I mean, all of those things are really, the erotic element is all very Chtonic as well. Nana became pregnant by inserting one of the fruits in her womb, which is different. You know, her bosom is not her womb in the other story, and gave birth to Attis. At Sangarius' wish, she abandoned him, because Sangarius did not want this child. But he was taken in by some passers-by and reared on honey and a billy goat's milk, hence his name, Attis, meaning he-goat, or beautiful in Phrygian, which is interesting. Attis grew very handsome, and King Midas of Pessinus determined he should marry one of his daughters, but during an argument between Agdistis and Kybele, Attis and his attendants became frenzied. Attis castrated himself beneath a pine tree and died. Kybele buried him, but violets grew round the pine tree from where the blood had fallen from his wounds. So this is really the resurrection myth, where his body becomes, just as the Adonis flower at the death of Adonis when he's gored to death by a boar in the story, where he is also born, he's born from a myrrh tree. And it's interesting that you have all of these beautiful male figures that are born from a tree. But the tree is usually there because of something that is extraordinary or taboo, okay? If we think about the myth of Myrrha, she is made to fall in love with her father. And with the help of her nursemaid, she manages to secretly have sex with her father and gets pregnant. But when the father finds out, naturally he's going to kill her and her child, so she runs away and asks to be saved, and she's turned into a myrrh tree. And so Adonis is born, but he is the product of incest. Now, incest is actually another component of all of this. And so Adonis is raised, Aphrodite takes the child, because Aphrodite is the one who has punished Myrrha for her some transgression, and this is why she's made to fall in love with her father. This is one of the things Aphrodite does. And then she gives the child to Persephone for safekeeping, but Persephone in the underworld falls in love with the child. So there's an argument between Aphrodite and Persephone. And finally, almost in the manner of Demeter and Persephone's story, the boy is told he can choose where he has to spend half the year with one. He has to spend 3 months of the year with one of his mothers, and it was like he had to spend 3 months with another, and he could pick the other 6 months as to where he wanted to be. And so he decided he spends 3 months with Persephone, but he spends the rest of the year with Aphrodite because he likes being above ground. So Aphrodite and Adonis, go about together. He goes hunting, and then she gets a bad premonition that he is going to be killed on a boar hunt, but he ignores her and goes anyway. And of course, when he dies and it spills his blood, the blood becomes an Adonis flower. So again, this is a cycle of what we call a dying and resurrecting vegetation god myth. This idea of the resurrecting deity resurrected through the fruits of the earth, really, and through these beautiful flowers because they were beautiful people, right? Okay, so Kybele had also buried Midas's daughter, who had killed. Let me switch my page here. Who killed herself in despair, and violets grew from her blood, and also an almond tree over her tomb. So the almond tree becomes a later thing in this one. Zeus granted Agdistis that Attis's body should not decay, his hair should continue to grow, and his little fingers should move. Agdistis founded a community of priests and a festival in Attis's honor at Pessinus. Okay, so this is interesting because Agdistis here, it's like we're in kind of this daimonic realm, so we're not necessarily, once again, dealing with people, although we are seeing these figures being married to, human princesses and things like that, or at least, trying to be. So there's a lot of this crossover between what we think of probably as the royal families with these either daimonic or daimonic beings or deities, depending on how you want to see them there. So, okay, so that's the basic story that we have connected to Agdistis. Now, there's another version here. I just want to make sure I get all the versions. Pausanias is the most, one that is probably the most well-known, but there's another version that was handed down by Timotheus. Okay, so according to Arnobius, who is a 4th century Christian apologist, he tells Timotheus's version. In Timotheus, who was no mean mythologist, and also in others equally well informed, the birth of the great mother of the gods and the origin of her rites are thus detailed, being derived, as he himself writes and suggests, from learned books of antiquities and from his acquaintance with the most secret mysteries. So this is almost a version of this that sounds like it's connected to a mystery cult in some way. Arnobius goes on to recount the story as follows. There was a rock in Phrygia called Agdis, from which this great mother was fashioned. Okay, so the great mother here is considered to be a rock called Agdis. Now, Jupiter, the Roman Zeus, desired to have intercourse with her, and as we've seen, this is originally the sky god, but unable to do so, let his seed fall upon the rock. From this rock was eventually born Agdistis, named so after Agdis, the mothering rock. In Agdistis was... Okay, so they said in Agdistis had a resistless might, actually. I thought it said restless. Resistless might, and a fierceness of disposition beyond control, a lust made furious and derived from both sexes. He violently plundered and laid waste. He scattered destruction wherever the ferocity of his disposition had led him. He regarded not gods or men, nor did he think anything more powerful than himself. He condemned earth, heaven, and the stars. Okay, it says, after the gods in their councils had considered what could be done to curb Agdistis, Liber, who is one of the Roman versions of Dionysus, taking the task upon himself, caused Agdistis to become drunk and fall asleep. With a snare, Liber tied Agdistis' foot to his genitals. When Agdistis finally woke up and stood, he tore his own genitals off. And from these, and the immense flow of blood upon the earth, grew a pomegranate tree. Now Sangarius' daughter Nana placed one of the fruits in her bosom, and as above, became pregnant with the boy Attis. When the pregnancy is discovered by her father, Nana is shut up in order to starve her to death, but she is kept alive by the mother of the gods. Attis is born, and Sangarius orders the child exposed. As before, the child is found and nurtured. By the way, that's typical of hero myths. And grows to be a surpassingly beautiful youth, whom the mother of the gods loved exceedingly. And as Attis grew up, Agdistis was his constant secret companion, fondling him and bound to him by wicked compliance with his lust, in the only way now possible, leading him through the wooded glades and presenting him with the spoils of many wild beasts, which the boy Attis at first said boastfully were won by his own toil and labor. Eventually, however, a drunken Attis confesses his relationship with Agdistis, and in order to save the youth from so disgraceful an intimacy, so this is the incestuous thing, Midas, the king of Pessinus, resolves to give Attis his daughter in marriage. On the day of the wedding, Midas has the gates of the city closed so that nothing might disrupt it. But the mother of the gods knows Attis's fate, and that he would never be safe if he married. So, wishing to prevent the marriage, she raised the city walls with her head and entered the city. And two entered Agdistis. In a jealous rage, Agdistis burst in upon the wedding, filling everyone with frenzied madness. So here's a being that can bring a being that was dangerous, needed to be castrated, and now is still dangerous, which causes Attis to castrate himself and die. The mother of the gods gathered up the severed genitals and buried them, and Agdistis and the mother of the gods joined together in the funeral wailings. Agdistis pleads for Jupiter to restore Attis to life. Jupiter refuses, but does grant that Attis's body will not decay, his hair should continue to grow, and his little fingers should live and ever move. Agdistis took the body to Pessinus, where it was consecrated and honored with yearly rites. So they talk here about the association with Kybele, and according to Strabo, the two goddesses were identified. The cultic center is Pessinus is the cultic center. However, even when Agdistis is considered to be distinct from Kybele, such as in Arnobius' account above, the two are closely associated, with Agdistis often being interpreted as a doublet or doubling of the Great Mother. Agdistis held a special place in the Phrygian religious traditions surrounding Kybele. The accounts of Agdistis given above revolve around Attis, who was the young consort of Kybele, and prototype of her eunuch priesthood. Because, I did the Kybele podcast ages ago, but Kybele is one of the Earth Mothers, and her priests castrate themselves. They're called the Galli, and that's what they do. The reference to eunuchs is interesting because there is a phrase in Matthew 19, chapter 19, verse 12 in the Bible that says, "For there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it." The verse is translated to mean that there are eunuchs who were born that way, and eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and eunuchs who have chosen to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, interestingly, this is also another rabbit hole we could go down, where the idea that priesthood must be celibate, because they're interpreting being a eunuch as being celibate. But this is really a reference back to the Kybele cult, which was still a practiced religion in ancient Rome. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I get into the Roman ideas about hermaphrodites. Okay? So, yeah. So the idea of being a eunuch, really, when you have this in the priesthood, which we tend to think of as a very, particularly the Catholic Church that says priests may not marry, priests and nuns may not marry, they must remain celibate, particularly the priests. This is the idea of making them eunuchs. So we're really carrying on this kind of, Phrygian Earth Mother tradition, which is really very interesting. And it's almost like the idea that the power of the phallus is dangerous. Now, another story we could potentially compare this to. Now, I want to be careful to say that I'm not suggesting that these are the same story, but I find it very interesting in the Old Testament of the Bible, in the story of Noah, which is in Genesis. I want to say it's Genesis 5, 6, like around there. And we have the story of the flood. It's said that the reason that Yahweh brings the flood is because of the birth of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim are the products of the mating of humans and angels. Okay, so, the angels, find the human women desirable, mate with them, and they give birth to this race of giants, which then Yahweh says, and they had the same, their appearance ends up having the same impact, at least in some versions, as that we see with Agdistis, at least in that version that we saw by Arnobius, where they're very, very destructive, and they run around and they devour everything and they destroy everything, and nothing is sacred to them. And so they have to be, in the case of the biblical story, they're laid waste by a flood. Now, mind you, they're not considered to be a hermaphrodite, but the idea is that the Nephilim have fearsome powers that have to be curbed. And in fact, in the Bible, it says these Nephilim were probably the heroes of old. So they were referring more to the idea of mortals who have mated with gods, or with angelic beings or demonic beings, having this special power. Now, obviously, that's not the case with Agdistis, so this is not really a side-by-side comparison of a story. But it's very interesting about the idea, okay, angels coming down from heaven and having sex with women who are on Earth, okay? So now this is another marriage of heaven and Earth, like Ouranos and Gaia, like the sky god, whether it be Zeus, Jupiter, whoever, whatever the Phrygians would have called the sky god, and either Kybele or Agdis, or the Earth Mother in whatever name or form, mating together. It's heaven and earth mating together. Okay, this is the common element between the three of them. And when they are brought together, what they bring about are often what are considered to be monstrous creatures. So the Nephilim, even though these are sometimes considered to be, this is the way that the biblical interpretation was interpreting the heroes of the Trojan War, like Achilles and trying to think of the other ones who are. He's the first one that always comes to mind when I think of one who has a whose father is Zeus usually, or is some other kind of some other immortal. Aeneas is another one. Who I'm trying to think who else off the top of my head is one of the heroes who has I want to say Perseus certainly was. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. And so the idea that these people who are more than human and have attributes of the gods. Similarly, the hermaphrodite was said to have the attributes of the gods. Plato talks about this in the Symposium. In fact, this is his discussion of love and why love exists. And for him, love was the idea that humans were originally all hermaphrodites, but that the gods feared that they were too powerful, so they separated them. And so that when people fall in love, presumably male-female relationships, that they are these two halves trying to come back together again. And that makes me think of the Hindu myth of Sri Ardhanarishwara, where Shiva explains to Parvati that his body is actually part of hers, that they are actually, even though they are two separate beings, they are actually united in some way. And then she declares that she wants to share his limbs, to be one with his limbs. And so they merge into this one being that is called Sri Ardhanarishwara, which is half male and half female, at least in how it appears. And so, yeah, this is the idea of the power. And of course, in Tantra, we're talking about the power of Shiva Shakti when it comes together. If you follow Kundalini yoga and thinking about Kundalini, the idea is that Shakti is at the root, at the base, because she's associated with the earth, right? She's associated with the Ketonic, the root chakra, that which connects you to the earth. Shiva is up around the area of the Ajna, or the third eye, and the crown and the top. So the more, what we think of now is more the celestial or spiritual in the way that we tend to think about it now. So the idea is that Shakti rises up to meet Shiva. And that's when your Kundalini rises. And when your Kundalini rises, if you can maintain a Kundalini energy that is completely risen all the time, which I don't know anybody who can, but if you could, that is the moment in which you can experience samadhi, where you can experience enlightenment, because you will now see everything for what it is. You will not. One of the things that comes with the samadhi experience is that you see things in their. You don't see things quite as separate, and I don't mean that means that everything globs together like a big ball of one thing, but that you recognize that, the distinctions that we make, the judgments that we make between, using the sword of discrimination, right? This is good, this is bad, this is this is dark, this is light. That a lot of those distinctions go away in that state, because you realize that all of it is part of this singular kind of reality or continuity, or that is well beyond human comprehension. The reason that we have to break things down into smaller pieces is because our minds cannot comprehend something that's that big. We have to break things down. We work in measurements. We work in mathematics, right? This is the way we try to understand reality. We break things down. What does science do? It tries to break things down into smaller components to try to understand what things are made of and what the quote-unquote laws are that govern them, right? So we have this, our conception, our rational conception of the world is one that separates. That is why in the tarot, it is connected with the element of swords, is connected with the intellect. It is that which cuts through, it discriminates. It allows you to see things, this is one thing, that's another thing. And so this is going to bring me back to the creation myths. Hesiod's myth of Ouranos and Gaia, which I think I've mentioned before, is when everything comes out. You have the first five beings that come out of chaos in Greek, that Greek creation myth. You have Erebus, Tartarus, Nyx, Gaia, what was the other one? And Eros, okay? Erebus, Tartarus, Nyx, Gaia, Eros. Yes, right, 5. Make sure I'm not missing one. And Eros, of course, as we know, is that erotic drive, that is connected, but we connect with the earth, with desire, with sensuality, certainly at its biological necessity level, the need to procreate, but it's not just about procreation. It's also about just about the sensual drive that we have, that we associate with the earth and the ability to produce. And all of those other elements besides the Earth Mother are those connected to night, to darkness. Tartarus, of course, is the deepest darkness of the abyss, and Erebus is the gloom that we associate with the underworld. So in short, in Hesiod's mythology, the underworld is the first thing to exist, and then the erotic drive that comes out of it. So this is almost the idea of, yes, the depths of the earth and the depths of the Earth Mother with that erotic drive that produces and brings life about. So, but here we have the sky god, Ouranos, who is born, and he is born from Gaia, and then he mates with her. So we've already got, and you have incest in a lot of these relationships with the gods. They're all incest. You'll see a lot of those kinds of connections, and really the incest. Okay, incest among the gods. You'll frequently, Kronos and Rhea are brother and sister, and they're married, right? You have Zeus's wife Hera is also his sister. It's not, because you have to recognize that these are forces, and the idea of our human ideas about incest and the taboo around incest has to do with us as humans. It doesn't have to do, deities don't follow those sets of rules. This is why I always say it's ridiculous to try to apply human morals to beings that are regarded as divine or demonic. I mean, they have, some of them may have a certain purpose or function, but they operate within some kind of boundaries or rule system, at least as they're understood. But this is how the laws of nature are understood. But strictly speaking, they don't have to. I mean, they're not like us. Okay. So in that mythology, Ouranos and Gaia mate, and they produce all of these children. I mean, and they do produce some of the they produce many of the Titans and the at least some of the 12. Well, really, I think it's Kronos and Myrrha who produce most of the 12. But Kronos is one of the children, and Kronos' name means time. Okay, when you think of chronology, right? Or if you're a Unix programmer, you have your cron jobs. All this relates back to Kronos, has to do with time. And what happens is that Gaia starts producing these monstrous beings, like the giants with 100 hands, and all these other beings that Ouranos doesn't like. He's frightened by them. And we think about the monstrosities of the earth, right? The beast that lives under the earth, the monster that one encounters in the underworld, often seen as female, but nonetheless, you have this idea of these kinds of monstrous beings that come out of the earth. This is where you have the dragon Typhus that comes out of the earth. And all of these are the products of this Earth Mother, this serpentine kind of energy, or this idea of these giants, or these beings that are lawless in their own way. They're chaotic. And so he tries to stuff them back into the earth. And as Ginny Phelan used to say, she'd say that try to imagine you're trying to give birth and your spouse is trying to shove the baby back inside of you. It's that kind of a thing. And Gaia, of course, is crying out in pain over this. And so she says to her children, "Who's going to help me against your father?" And Kronos says, "I'll do it." So she gives him a sickle. And when Ouranos comes to mate with her, he cuts off his member. Okay, he castrates him. And that act of castration separates earth and sky forever. His genitals fall into the sea. And interestingly, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is born out of the foam. She's called foam-born, and also several giants are also born. But there's this idea that the sky god is now castrated. The sky god is a eunuch, okay? He's lost his ability to reproduce. And so now Gaia, they're no longer together. Okay, they're separated from each other, and he has lost his member. So he's a eunuch. It's enforced celibacy for you. So you have this. So okay, if you want to look at that myth in another way, you're really looking at this as the way in which we come into the field of time. The three dimensions of space and time that we know, comes because it's not an accident that Kronos, that time is the one who separates. Time is a measurement. It's the way in which we try to order things out of what we consider to be chaos. Because these other beings tend to represent something chaotic, something out of the order that we expect or think of as quote unquote natural, right? Even though it all is natural. And to me, this kind of represents the chaos that underlies everything, but that we feel we have to control. And interestingly, that chaos is often represented through the phallus. Yet the phallus is part of the generative power. Okay, it's at least really the generative power requires both sides. It requires the male and the female side. And in this case, this idea that once things are creating things that are creating too much chaos, or creating certain beings that have the potential, it's actually it's almost like an excess of that energy that can actually be destructive rather than creative. Okay, so it needs to be curbed in some way. And this lays the foundation for a world in which things are ordered by measurements, by time. The sun rises and sets at a certain time, right? Tides come in and out at a certain time. We measure things according to time. We understand the world according to separateness and according to time. And as Joseph Campbell said, the Western religious traditions, all of them, are based on the insight of what he calls duality, the insight of the fact that we are separate. Eastern religions are different because they look at the insight that transcends duality. They say, yes, you talk about Maya, illusion, the goddess who creates the illusion that everything is separate, but the reality behind it is that everything is unified in some way, like it's all part of one system. So the religions end up focusing on different things. One focuses on the connections between everything, the other focuses on the separation. And these are certainly myths of separation, because certainly in that Arnobius's version, we're looking at the idea that the hermaphrodite who is dual sexed has too much power because the masculine and feminine are united, and that makes one almost like a god, or makes one more powerful than a god in a way. So therefore, that really gets interesting when you think about that. Okay, and you think about the psychology of male and female, and the ways in which we deal with that, the ways in which we in our society want to maintain those strict separations, and the way in which we insist that, that we have to, people who feel that power has to be balanced in a certain way with male and female. But male and female doesn't have to just be balanced by biology. Masculine and feminine elements can be balanced in other ways too. But the person who is fully comfortable and in charge of their masculine and feminine sides, so the woman in control of the animus and her masculine side, the man who is maybe in control of is not the right way to say it. That's a very, who has been able to integrate and flow with those two sides of themselves, is somebody who's extraordinarily powerful. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit quickly about the hermaphrodite, because I know I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, we're getting close to an hour here already. But let's talk about the term hermaphrodite. So first of all, what does that mean? Hermaphroditus is literally is the term names Hermes or Hermaeus and Aphrodite together, and considered to be a child of Hermaeus, who is also known as Mercury, the liminal god who moves between the celestial and the Chthonic realms, and Aphrodite, of course, who is the goddess of love, who in this case would be sort of this representation of Eros. They come together and create this being that is dual-sexed. However, now according to Ovid, I'm going to tell you about the notorious fountain of Salmacis, how it is so and why it softens and weakens men who bathe in its strength-sapping stream. Its effects are renowned, though the reasons a mystery. Mercury once had a son by the goddess Venus. Okay, Mercury and Venus are Hermes, or Hermaeus, and Aphrodite. Nurtured and reared by the naiads who dwell in the caves on Mount Ida. Father and mother could both be seen in his handsome features. Between them, they also gave him a name, Hermaphroditus. Once he had reached the age of 15, he abandoned his native mountains. Ida, his foster mother, was left behind as he ventured forth to explore the unknown, the sight of new places. New rivers enthralled him, excitement taking the pain out of travel. He came as far as the cities of Lycia and Lycia's neighbors and Caria. Here he discovered a pool which was perfectly clear right through to the bottom, entirely empty of marshy reeds, unfertile sedge-grass, and spiky rudges. The crystalline water was lushly fringed by a circle of fresh and evergreen grass. Now this was the home of a nymph, but one who didn't enjoy the normal pursuits of archery, hunting, and running races. The only naiad not to belong to the train of Diana, so she was not connected to Artemis. Often the story goes, her anxious sisters would say, "Why don't you take out your javelin," etc. So we have this whole story of Salmacis. So we get that she doesn't want to engage in the thing. She's more interested in feminine wiles than in being, than in the kind of hunting and that her sisters engage in. Sometimes she'd gather flowers, and she chanced to be gathering flowers when she saw this glorious boy and wanted at once to possess him. Keen as she was to approach him, she didn't move closer until she had made herself pretty. She cast a careful eye on her dress and arranged her expression. Nobody now could have questioned her beauty. At last she spoke. "Magnificent boy, one could easily take you to be a god. If you are a god, you surely must be Cupid. If only immortal, why then your parents are wonderfully blessed." And so she goes on this whole thing. And so she says him, "But far away and happy all if you are betrothed is the maid whom torches escort to your house in the wedding procession. If she's already chosen, allow me a stolen pleasure. If not, let me be your bride and take me at once to your bed." So much from the nymph. The cheeks of the lad were covered in blushes. He didn't know what love was, but even his blushes became him. His skin was the color of apples on trees in a sun-drenched orchard, or ivy steeped in dye, or the moon in eclipse when its whiteness is turned to red, and cymbals are clashed in vain to restore it. That's back to the whole eclipse mythology. The naiad continually begged him to kiss her, at least like a sister, and started to put her hands on his ivory-colored neck, where he shouted, "Stop, or I'll run away and abandon you here." Salmacis quivered with fear. "The place is entirely yours, young stranger," she said as she turned on her heels and pretended to leave. But even then, she kept looking back and secreted herself in the bushes, crouched down on her knee. Hermaphroditus, thinking he had the grass to himself and no one was watching, walked up and down by the pool and dipped his toes in the lapping play of the stream and immersed his feet as far as his ankles. The water was lovely and deliciously cool. Without further ado, he removed his tunic, and so smooth from his body, so slender. Salmacis was now wildly excited. The sight of him naked fired her desire to new heights. Her eyes were also on fire, like the dazzling light of the sun's reflected ray. It raised a captured shining disk at its brightest and clearest. Any delay or postponement of joy was almost impossible. Out of control in her frenzy, she had to embrace him now. So she goes over and says, "Victory, he's all mine," and then she strips off all her clothes, dived in after him, grabs a hold of his limbs as he struggled against her, greedily kissing him, sliding her hands underneath to fondle his unresponsive nipples, and wrapping herself round each side in turn. For all his valiant attempts to slip from her grasp, she finally held him tight in her coils, like a snake carried aloft in an eagle's talons, forming knots round the head and the feet. The boy held out like a hero, refusing the nymph the delights that she craved for. Salmacis squeezed harder, and then, pinning the whole of her body against him, clung there and cried, "You may fight as you will, you wretch, but you shan't escape me. Gods, I pray you decree that the day never comes when the two of us here shall be riven asunder." Her prayer found gods to fulfill it. The bodies of boy and girl were merged and melded as one. The two of them showed but a single face. You know, when a twig is grafted onto a tree, the stalk and branch will join as they grow and mature together. They were two no more, but of double aspect, which couldn't fairly be described as male or female. They seemed to be neither and both. So this is how we have the idea of the hermaphrodite. So this is Salmacis goes and she basically is, driven by lust, and when he refuses her, she basically throws herself at him, and when he tries to fight her off, she prays that they be united. So if you think about that story, you have this young boy who's actually very innocent and very beautiful, okay, just like we had these beautiful men like Attis or like Adonis. He's very beautiful, but he's also very, he doesn't know the ways of love and of eroticism and of sex. And this nymph, of course, is really almost the polar opposite. She embodies this pure erotic sexuality. So it's like when she cleaves to him, they become this kind of a being that's born out of this frenzy. Okay, so let me just mention one other thing here. I want to talk about the hermaphrodite this is according to Anthony Corbet from his chapter on what he calls the prodigious hermaphrodite. And this has to do with Rome and the Romans and how they viewed hermaphrodites. Okay. Hermaphrodite, the connection between divine will and dual sexuality in humans prompts a consideration of archaic Roman views on what constitutes the sacred. So, now we're getting into the realm of the taboos. So here's what he has to say. The hermaphrodite cannot normally reproduce sexually, nor is it likely to be married, two factors that would cause a Roman to consider such a creature a potential outcast from human society. As a result, the special treatment accorded the child at birth requires explanation. Some parallels from Rome's historical period provide a perspective on this treatment. The liminal sexuality of the hermaphrodite may be compared with another anomalous group of the Republican era, meaning Roman Republican era, the priests that served the Magna Mater. Imported to Rome during the Second Punic War following consultation of the Cybele books and the Delphic Oracle, once again at a time of communal crisis, this cult had many features that the Romans deemed exotic. The goddess was represented by an aniconic rock. Although a foreign import, Magna Mater received a temple within Rome's sacred boundaries. And in a move that Romans found outrageous, the priests of the Magna Mater, or the Galli, consisted of men who had undergone a ritual of voluntary self-castration. These quote-unquote illegitimate women and quote-unquote half-men, dancing through Rome to the percussion of exotic instruments, allegedly engaged in sordid forms of deviant sexual activity, received attention in Roman literature across a wide variety of genres. Roman texts show perplexity with and even a repulsion at the self-inflicted sexuality of the Galli, to such an extent that legislation barred the native-born Romans from serving as priests. Nevertheless, these religious figures were tolerated as something inconstruable and therefore members of the realm of the sacred. Now, we hear about the same idea with shamans, the idea that they have a foot in both worlds. The fact that these are men without who have been castrated, men who are eunuchs, they are now neither men nor women in their view. Okay, so they belong to this liminal space, which is taboo. Now, the way the Romans dealt with a child that might be born as a hermaphrodite, because it does happen, is Romulus apparently sets the law to say that if you the child, that basically a hermaphroditic child has to be handed over to the religious and political authorities to decide whether or not this child can live, because the child's birth is considered to be an omen, and they need to determine whether this is an omen that is good and that this child is going to bring protection from malevolent forces, or whether the birth of this child was a bad omen and therefore should be exposed or killed or whatever. But interestingly, hermaphrodites and other children who were not considered to be born, where there was something unnatural about their birth, either in how they looked or something else, basically they said you can expose a child like that under the age of 3, but only if you have the consent of 5 of your neighbors. It's an interesting rule that was set forth there, but I think it's just so parents couldn't just suddenly decide to expose their children. Exposing, of course, meaning that you leave them out to the elements, and if they're meant to survive, they will. In other words, you don't accept them as part of the family. You reject them and put them out. And there's a lot of heroic stories that end up this way. The Oedipus myth is one, where Oedipus is exposed because of the oracle that says he'll kill his father and marry his mother. But this really is interesting, because now, to kind of sum up on this a little bit, we almost have this trifecta around the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, or either the Sky Father or who is castrated, or you have the hermaphrodite who is castrated, and therefore those who follow the cult of the Earth Mother are castrated, because it's almost as though this is an element that is and then we have this trifecta kind of, maybe, I guess, because you have Earth Mother, castrated individual, castrated either god or hermaphrodite or priest or whatever. You have this castrated figure, and then you have the taboo of incest, because in all of these cases, even the one I mentioned with the Adonis myth, Adonis is the product of incest. Really, Agdistis, when after losing the him her, losing her member, really, or his member, however you want to look at it, is which becomes this almond tree, which then impregnates Nana, and then the child that's born of that. I mean, really, this is the child of that other part of Agdistis. So really, that's a type of incest as well. Or this child becomes the child itself was not a product of incest, but you have this incestuous kind of relationship that is then considered to be unseemly or taboo. You can't be having sex with somebody who's like sort of your father and you're sort of your father. Well, really, yeah, it's almost like having sex with your father, who's now in the form of your mother. But it's the way in which you're talking about this liminal sexuality. Now, in Diane Purkis's book, which has to do with fairies and fairy folk, called "On the Bottom of the Garden" is the title of the book. One of the things she mentions about fairy stories and fairy lore is the way in which these tend to be connected, especially in the Inquisition trials, to brother-sister incest. That they would be, these brothers and sisters who they were violating this taboo. And she gets into the detail about how violating this taboo puts you outside of the community. It puts you into almost another category. It puts you into a liminal space, because now you have violated one of the very basic laws of the society. Okay, because incest, this is another form of devouring energy, is what it is. Because if you think about the idea of, let's just say, the father with the daughter, or the mother with the son, or however it's construed in these mythologies, when you have this kind of, it's kind of what they call keeping it in the family, but not in a good way. It's the idea that when you have this idea of succession, the myths of succession, which are connected not only to the immortals, but to mortals, and to the idea of family lineage and ancestry. You want to perpetuate the family line. So if you cut that off by having incest within your family, well, not only biologically are there many reasons that humans, many biological problems with incest. Never mind that most of us go, ew, gross. Although there have been examples of people who have engaged in incestuous relationships, it does happen. But there's a strong taboo against it because you could look at it from a lot of people try to look at it biologically and say, well, yes, but all kinds of horrible defects and stuff can come out of a child who is born from incest. But in terms of the psychological element, it almost puts you, or really the magical element, it puts you in this kind of taboo space. Oedipus, who ends up committing incest with his mother, completely unwittingly, ends up becoming, once he recognizes his crime and puts his eyes out, he ends up becoming almost a magical being. Like by the time you get to Oedipus at Kronos in the myths, he almost like has an apotheosis. He's taken up almost like a deity. He's become a very special kind of a being. And when we think about the separation between the sacred and the profane, like I said, like the role that the shaman would often have, because the shaman dealt with the other world, and it was taboo for people to do certain things because that was a sacred space, right? Similarly, here we're talking about the hermaphrodite as belonging to that sacred space. It's that space in between that's not the realm that we live in. And there are special people, and they're sacred, so therefore they need to be respected, but they're also shunned in a lot of ways too, because they are out on the edge. And now, we don't live in a society that holds these kinds of beliefs, but it's very interesting how we have still, especially towards people who are born intersexed, or people who are trans, or just people who engage in sexualities that people consider to be quote-unquote non-traditional. Which, by the way, I mean, homosexuality has been around forever, but it's not, and even the ancient Greeks and Romans certainly practiced it. It was very normal is what I mean. It wasn't one of those things that was considered taboo. But but the idea that anything that falls out of, you have the male and the female that are separated, and when the two of them come together in some form, whether it's because a woman is having a relationship with another woman and therefore quote unquote acting like a man, or vice versa, a man having a relationship with another man and then quote unquote being feminine or acting like a woman, it's almost like it's the element of the hermaphrodite. It's this being that is almost too powerful and has the potential to be threatening and destroy. Now, people who are against those kinds of things, who are anti-trans or anti-homosexual, they tend to try to cite either very traditional or very biblical reasons for being against it. Oh, well, the Bible says. Well, the Bible doesn't say. But, the only person who has anything against homosexuality is St. Paul. And St. Paul's against everything. So he's, So it's not something that really comes out of the Bible. The Bible doesn't really talk about this. But it goes back to that idea about the separation of things. The idea that it has that to unite the two somehow is going to bring us back to an element of chaos. And there's again, by our rational minds, there's no reason for this. I'm not even saying in the irrational realm that there's a reason to fear this, but that is what is feared. It's this fear. It's the idea of either being acting outside its role has the potential to be something that is threatening. So very interesting things to think about. Now I'm looking at my time and I'm like, okay, I have reached an hour. So I think what I'm going to finish up with is just mention a little bit about the cult of Agdistis here. Strabo had said in his geography, the Phrygians in general hold Rhea or Kybele in honor and worship with her orgia or orgies, calling her Meter Theon, mother of the gods, Agdistis, and Phrygia, the great goddess. Let's see. And also, the Wikipedia mentions Ullikummi, who is a Hurrian, considered to be a monster, is found in a Hittite text called Song of Ullikummi, where, like Agdistis, Ullikummi is born from a rock that has been impregnated by a god, presents a challenge to the ruling gods, and the gods cut Ullikummi, severing him from his strength. Walter Burkert has noted that the beginning of the Song of Ullikummi corresponds nearly sentence for sentence with the beginning of Arnobius' account of Agdistis' story. So that's interesting as well. Here we go. In Anatolia, an inscription from Iconium invokes Agdistis alongside Apollo and Artemis as among those gods considered to be saviors, or the Theoi Soteris, and an altar at Cisma represents both Agdistis and the Great Mother. And so, so there's this idea So that's interesting. So you in some cults you have this idea along Apollo and Artemis, which by the way you could see them as representing. I mean, they're twins, right? There's the idea of the two of them, the male and the female. Again, they have somewhat different representations connected to more civilized kinds of pursuits. Artemis with hunting, and also in Apollo being the god who's connected to light, civilization, poetry, oracles, music. The two of them together, like having this kind of a saving kind of grace. But then you have Agdistis also as being among that what they call the Theoi Soteris, and that's a very interesting idea, because if there's the idea that the hermaphrodite represents something destructive where you have to separate the sexes, then really to me, looking at these pairings along with Agdistis suggests that at least in some versions of the cult, the idea of the male and female united is actually something that is a saving grace, not something that is a curse. And so there you go. Do we regard the masculine and feminine coming together as our saving grace, or do we see it as a curse? But probably a lot more that could be said about this. Thank you so much for listening. I want to once again thank my patrons, as I always do at the beginning of the episode. I do want to remind people that I am an affiliate of the Divine Feminine app, so please check the description for both the podcast, and also if you're on YouTube, I will have it in the description there. Please consider signing up to have all kinds of information about events and resources and other things connected to the Divine Feminine, local events for people who are interested in attending sacred circles, and so on and so forth. And you can find me on Chthonia.net. I have all my work and all my publications and any current updates. I have my separate website for my business transition life coaching, which is being updated and changed. So all of those updates will be at Chthonia.net, as well as all the links to my social media and everything else are there. But if you want to just find me on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast. One word on Instagram and X. It's 2 words on Facebook, and it's just Chthonia, or you could do Chthonia Podcast, 1 word, on YouTube and find me there as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.